This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to continue to learn to play Falling Sky. Falling Sky was released in 2016 by GMT Games and designed by Andrew Ronke and Volko Ronke. This game supports up to 4 players and takes 3 to 6 hours to play. Welcome back to the second episode in our rules breakdown for Falling Sky by GMT Games. In this episode, we will be discussing the rules for commands. But before we jump into those rules, let's talk about some useful aids the game does provide. Included in the game box are several fold-out player aids that display each faction and their commands and special abilities. Each page in this fold-out showcases a faction. The left side shows that faction's commands, and the right side their special abilities. A box in the lower right-hand corner provides a reminder of all players' victory conditions. A second reference fold-out provides the commands for the NPC faction, the Germanics. While the Germanic tribe does not have special abilities, they do have a variation on their commands that they may conduct during the winter phase. Another fold-out player aid contains helpful flowcharts that assist players with the sequence of play, the winter phase, and every possible situation when conducting a battle procedure. Keep these resources handy for guidance as you play through your own games. Next, let's go to the gameplay area. In the last episode, we discussed cards and how it fed into the sequence of play chart in the lower left-hand corner of the game board. Remember, 2 players out of the 4 will each take their turn per card. Ultimately, the first player for each card dictates the flow path that both players will follow. For example, if the first faction selects command only, then the second faction must choose limited command. If the first faction selects command plus special ability, then the second faction can either play the event on the card or a limited command. Finally, if the first faction selects to play the event on the card, then the second faction may play a command with a special ability if they choose. With that in mind, let's now discuss how each command works. The game comes with 2 sets of colored pawns. I typically use the white pawns for commands and the black pawns for special abilities. When a player issues a command to their forces or executes a special ability, the pawns are used to mark the territories where these will take effect. Many of these commands can be used in multiple region spaces, which is why there are several pawns. This makes it easy to keep track of the region spaces where the commands and special abilities must be resolved. Most commands cost resources to implement. As a reminder, a player's available resources are tracked with their short cylinders, which are located on the number track at the top of the board. With full command ability, a faction is allowed to take as many commands as they can afford. When playing a limited command, the faction is restricted to just 1. Now that we've covered off on all these basics regarding commands, let's look at an overview for all commands in the game. Coin games are notorious for their asymmetrical gameplay. Essentially, every faction plays differently, which means a player needs to learn each player's unique rule sets to effectively play the game. The good news is that the factions of Falling Sky have a lot more similarities in their playstyle than differences. While each command has a thematic name and may be subtle in differences between factions, at their core, they allow players to take very similar actions. Recruit and Rally allow a faction to place game pieces. March enables a faction to move their game pieces across the game board. Seize and Raid are mostly about taking resources. And Battle allows one player to remove another player's game pieces. Now, following this structure, let's take a look at each command category. When using the Recruit or Rally command to place pieces, we covered most of those rules in the last episode, but here's a condensed refresher. Most commands cost factions resources. During the time period of the Gallic Wars, resources equals wheat, which is symbolized by a faction's short cylinder on the number track. In regards to paying for the recruit command, the Roman faction is unique because they can recruit for free as long as they can trace an unopposed supply line from the region they wish to recruit back to Cisalpina. Cisalpina is the gray territory next to Provincia, the Roman player's home base. However, if the supply line is broken, the Roman faction can still recruit at a cost of 2 resources per region. The other unique situation with cost is with the Belgic faction. Most Gauls can rally for a cost of 1 resource, except for the Belgic faction that can rally for 1 resource inside Belgica, but must pay 2 resources outside their nation. The placement procedure follows the leveling path discussed in the last episode. Once a faction has established regional control, or they're fortunate enough to have a leader in the region space, they can form alliances with any subdued tribe in the region. Once a tribal alliance is formed in a region, Gallic factions can generate war bands, and the Roman faction can generate auxilia. The number of these units that can be generated is equal to the number of a faction's leaders, forts or citadels, and allies in the region. If the region contains a city, a tribal circle with a diamond around it, then factions can also rally to upgrade an allied tribe on this space to a citadel. The only restrictions to this command is if the region is devastated. Devastation is an Averni special ability that destroys the region's crops, creating starvation and disorder. The Averni can ignore this condition if their leader Vercingetorix is in the space. Before we move on to other commands, let's discuss the mechanics for Roman supply lines. One advantage of the Roman faction is they may conduct their recruit command for free. Rome has this advantage because Julius Caesar's forces receive supply line support from Rome by way of Cisalpina. Cisalpina is the gray non-playable territory next to Provincia, and acts as the gateway from Italy to Gaul. Therefore, the source of Roman supplies begin in Cisalpina and extend into 3 bordering region spaces: Provincia, Ubi, and Sequani. Supply lines cross bordering regions, and their logistics are managed by each region's control space. From these 3 regions, potential Roman supply lines spiderweb across the map. For the Roman faction to use a supply line and receive a free recruitment command, a region must either be under their control or have no faction controlling it. If another faction controls the region, then the Roman faction must be granted permission from them to use the supply line that crosses their region. If the faction controlling that region says no, then the Roman supply line is broken. Regions that are cut off from Roman supply require the Roman faction to pay for their recruitment command to that region with resources. However, if a region is controlled by the German faction, they never grant passage. Keep the Roman supply line network in mind when playing the game, and help or hinder Rome's access to a supply line as it serves your own interests. Finally, before we move on, it's important to remember that each faction also has home regions that allow them to conduct a rally or recruit command. Rallies for Gallic factions, recruit for the Roman faction, respectively. A faction that rallies in a region marked with its emblem may place a warband if they're Gallic, or an auxilia if they're Roman, even if the faction has no ally, leader, or citadel there. Keep home regions in mind as well, as they fall outside the usual requirements for gaining new forces. In Falling Sky, march commands are issued by origin region, not destination region, like other coin games. Therefore, once a faction issues a march command in a region, the ordered units can move all together, in separate groups, or individually to other regions. Also remember that march commands cannot be issued once the winner card is revealed and there's a frost marker on the active card. A march command normally costs 2 resources for the Roman faction and 1 resource for Gallic factions. However, if the origin region is devastated, then the cost is doubled. To prepare a faction to march, any revealed warbands or auxilia are flipped to hide them. However, if Gallic warbands have a Roman scouted marker on them, they must remove this first. A Roman scouted marker prevents Gallic factions from hiding. Warbands need to be hidden to harass the enemy and conduct certain special abilities. Once warbands are scouted, it will take 2 marches to become hidden again. Otherwise, they must wait until winter. It takes 1 march to remove the scouted marker and a 2nd march to hide again. When conducting the actual march, the Roman faction's forces have the greatest range. Marching Roman forces can move up to 2 region spaces from their origin region, and if Julius Caesar is marching with a group, they can move up to 3 region spaces. Gallic factions, on the other hand, can march from their origin region space to an adjacent region space. However, if the Averni faction is marching with their leader, Vercingetorix, they can move up to 2 region spaces from their origin space. Be aware, though, certain regions or geographic boundaries may halt a faction's march, such as entering a devastated region space. Also, crossing the channel into or out of Britannia, or the river Rhenus into Germanica. A major crossing into or out of these special regions require an entire march to conduct. Finally, factions with greater marching range, such as the Roman faction and the Averni faction accompanied by their leader, may be subject to harassment. Whenever these factions enter and then leave a region space, an enemy faction with hidden warbands or auxilia can reveal them to inflict losses on the departing units. For every 3 warbands or auxilia an enemy faction reveals, they can inflict 1 loss on the exiting units in the march. A warband or auxilia unit in the march can absorb 1 loss. However, legions or leaders in the march can only be removed on a successful die roll of a 1 through 3. Next, let's walk through an example of a Roman march. First, the Roman player issues a march command, places a white pawn in Proventia, and pays 2 resources by lowering their resource marker 2 spaces on the number track at the top of the board. Because the march command was issued in Proventia, it becomes the origin region. Game pieces can each be moved individually or in groups anywhere the player wants as long as it's within their range. The Roman player decides to move all their units in Proventia. The Roman leader, Julius Caesar, 4 legions, and 4 auxilia. Of these game pieces, the Roman player first moves 2 auxilia west to the Averni region. Next, the Roman player moves Julius Caesar, 4 legions, and 2 auxilia north to the Aedui region. In the Aedui region, he decides to leave 1 auxilia behind, and the remainder of this group will proceed north to Mandubi. However, as the group of Romans leave the region, the Averni player announces they will harass the departing Romans with their 3 hidden warbands in the region. The Averni player then flips and reveals their 3 warbands and inflicts 1 loss on the Romans marching north. A quick note, harassment only works on marching units leaving a territory. The Roman auxilia staying behind will not be affected by the harassment. The Roman player decides to use one of its marching auxilia game pieces to absorb the loss. The survivors then proceed north into Mandubi. Commands aimed at taking resources are very different between the Roman and Gallic factions. With take resource type commands, a faction is usually attempting to steal resource points either from another player faction or the region itself. The Roman seize command is much more complex than that, so let's cover that one first. With the seize command, Rome can disperse whole tribes as well as forge through their possessions for resource points. However, this Roman action is so brutal, it can also inspire displaced tribesmen to rally in adjacent regions and hidden warbands in the region to lash back against the invaders. The benefit to the Roman faction by using this command is that dispersed tribal markers on a subdued tribal circle prevents Gallic factions from placing a tribal alliance disc on the space. Without a tribal alliance, other factions cannot develop the region for their own interests. Another advantage is dispersed tribes still count for Rome's victory points towards the more than 15 subdued tribes they need to win the game. Also, a dispersed tribe subtracts from the Belgic player's control points if they control the region, which hurts the Belgic player's victory condition. Now, let's look at an example of how the Roman faction seize command plays out. This example takes place in the nation of Belgica, located in the northern half of the game map. Let's see if the Roman faction has the necessary region requirements to conduct a seize command. The first phase of the seize command is dispersal. Dispersal requires Rome to have regional control. Rome must also have at least one of the 4 dispersed tribe markers available to them, and at least one tribal circle in the region must be at a subdued status, which means no tribes or citadels on it. Once these region requirements are met, the Roman player can place any available dispersal marker on any subdued tribal circles in the region. Looking at our example, Rome has control of the region. They have available dispersed tribe markers, and they decide to place one on the subdued Nervi tribe. There is only one other tribe in the region, and it has an allied disc on it, which makes it ineligible. Placing these dispersed markers does have repercussions, which lead us to Phase 2, Rally. In the Rally phase of a seize command, there is a chance that tribe members displaced from their homes by a dispersal marker will rally in adjacent regions. Factions that are affected by a dispersal in the region are checked in a specific order. First, for any Averni tribes, and then for any Belgic tribes. For each dispersed marker, the faction affected rolls a 6-sided die. On a roll of 1 to 3, the faction may take a free and immediate rally in any eligible adjacent region. Eligible means the region must be able to produce the faction's warbands and not have a devastation marker. Placing the dispersed tribe marker on the Nervi initiates potential rallies in the surrounding Belgic-controlled regions. These rallies must follow normal rally requirements. In this example, 2 out of the 3 adjacent regions would be eligible to rally pending a successful die roll. However, to expedite this example, we're going to assume the die rolls failed. Next, while tribal members are fleeing and potentially rallying in adjacent region spaces, the Roman faction then moves to Phase 3, which is the forage phase. In this phase, Rome takes 2 resources from each subdued tribe and tribes that are Roman allies. They then take 6 resources from subdued tribes that were just dispersed during the command. The only restriction from conducting this phase is if the region is devastated. For our example here, Rome would collect 6 resources for placing the dispersed tribe marker. Once the forage phase is resolved, this leads to the final phase, which is called harassment. In this phase, factions affected by the Roman seize command that have hidden warbands in the region space can choose to reveal 3 of these warbands to remove 1 Roman game piece in retaliation. Once factions reveal their warbands and losses are totaled, the Roman player must decide how they will absorb these losses. The Roman player can remove 1 auxilia or ally per loss. However, if the Roman player selects a legion or a fort, then they get to roll a die. On a 1 through 3, the legion or fort is removed. On a 4 through 6, the legion or fort survives. Back to our example, the Belgic tribe can reveal 3 of their hidden warbands to inflict a loss on the Roman forces. The Roman player decides to absorb this loss with an auxilia. And with that, the seize command ends. By comparison, a Gallic faction's raid command is much more straightforward. With raid, hidden Gallic warbands in a region space may reveal themselves to take resources. This command can be broken into two different tactics. The first tactic is to take resources from the region itself. This requires at least one hidden Gallic warband, one tribal circle at the subdued level, and no devastation markers in the region. For every warband flipped and revealed to a maximum of 2 warbands, the player can take one resource from the region each. The second raid tactic is to take resources from another faction. This version of raid requires at least one hidden Gallic warband and an allied tribe from another faction to target. However, there are some restrictions. A city cannot be targeted if its tribe has been upgraded to a citadel, and a Roman allied tribe cannot be targeted if there is a fort in the region. If these criteria are met, once again, for every warband flipped and revealed to a maximum of 2 warbands, the player can take one resource each from the targeted faction. Okay, now let's look at a quick example. In this region space, there are 3 tribes. Starting from the left, the Senones, which have an alliance with Rome, the city tribe of Mandubi with an Averni alliance, and finally Lingones, which has no alliance with any of the factions and is currently subdued. The Aedui player wants to conduct a raid and has 2 warbands. They conduct the raid, which doesn't cost them any resources, and flip their maximum 2 warbands to their revealed side. Next, the Aedui player needs to declare where they're going to conduct the raid. The first option for the Aedui faction is to conduct a raid in Lingones. This would be a Type A raid, taking resources from the region itself. This requires a subdued tribe, which Lingones is, and is eligible if the region is not devastated, which it is not. The Aedui would get 2 resources for raiding here directly from the region, which means none of the other factions' resource markers would be affected. However, the Aedui could also raid in Mandubi. This would be a Type B raid where the resources are taken from another faction. In this case, they would be stealing resources from the Averni. Although Mandubi is a city tribe, it has not yet been upgraded to a citadel, so a raid is still possible here. The final tribal circle in the region, Senones, unfortunately cannot be raided by the Aedui. Although it's a normal tribal circle with a Roman ally, there is a Roman fort in the region space which prevents raids. Hopefully this example gives you a better idea of how raids function for Gallic players. This is the flowchart for Falling Skies Battle Command. This chart contains every possible decision path and outcome for a battle. A comprehensive flow like this can be pretty daunting for new players. Therefore, I'm going to draw a diagram that captures the majority of the mechanics on this flowchart. Full disclaimer though, it is nearly impossible to capture every nuance and situation presented here. After all, that's why there's a flowchart. In short, I'm saying you will still use this chart to make sure you account for every possibility. However, the alternate view I'm about to provide hopefully will give you a picture of what's going on and help you visualize interactions as you work your way through this flow. The battle command is the most complex function in the game. However, before we wade out into the deep end of the pool, let's first take another look at the game pieces and how they're used in battle. In the rules, game pieces are often referred to as forces. However, to teach all the nuances of the battle command, let's further break down the force classification into soldiers and structures. Soldier game pieces can fight and retreat. When attacking, warbands inflict a half a point of damage, called a loss, and auxiliary and leaders inflict 1 point of damage, or losses. Each whole point of damage may remove 1 enemy game piece from the board. Now, with all that said, Auxiliary and leader game pieces are exceptionally strong and can only be removed with a successful die roll. If the die result is 1 through 3, they are removed. A 4 through 6, and they survive. Structure-type game pieces cannot fight or retreat. They may provide defenses. Allied tribe discs provide no bonus modifiers. However, they are the key building block for recruitment, so you don't want to lose them. Citadels and forts, on the other hand, do provide defenses. These structures will halve the attacker's total damage. This ability makes them the key defensive structures for the game. This also means, as strong game pieces, that if selected for losses, they can only be removed on a die roll of 1 through 3. A die result of 4 through 6 means they survive. Now that we've had a refresher on the role of game pieces and their abilities in combat, I'm going to draw out a diagram for the battle command. This diagram already assumes that the attacking faction has issued a battle command, placed a white pawn in a targeted region, and already paid their required resources. After that has happened, the attacker selects one faction in the targeted region as the defender. The defender then must make a choice. They can choose to retreat or stand and fight. The defender cannot retreat under the following conditions. They are facing an ambush, which is a special ability that we'll cover in the next episode. They are Germanic, which means they never retreat, or their forces in the region are only comprised of structures which cannot move. Let's assume these situations are not the case and first work our way through the retreat path. The attacker then calculates the losses they will inflict on the defender. Remember, only soldier forces can inflict losses. Auxilia or warbands inflict half a point of loss each, unless it's the Belgic tribe and their leader Ambiorix is in the battle. Losses inflicted by Belgic warbands with their leader are doubled to 1 point each. Any leader involved in the battle add 1 loss point. And for the Roman faction, legions in the battle inflict 1 loss point each. However, if the Roman leader Julius Caesar is in the battle, this amount is doubled to 2 loss points each. All loss points for each soldier force type is then totaled and rounded down. For example, 1.5 loss points would be rounded down to 1 loss point. Next, the defender will need to absorb these losses. But first, let's discuss their situation a little. When the defender declares a retreat, only the soldier forces leave the battle. Where they retreat to is complicated, and I'll show you all the options available on another slide. For now, let's assume there is an adjacent friendly region willing to take them in. As for the losses the defender needs to absorb, whenever they retreat, this number is cut in half. When applying the losses, remember the defender's soldier forces abandon any structures and are leaving the battle. Therefore, the losses that are halved are applied first to structures, in other words, allies, citadels, and forts. Each point of loss can potentially remove 1 game piece. The defender will choose which casualties from these structures to absorb the losses. Allies are immediately removed. Citadels and forts can roll a die to see if they survive. On a die result of 1 through 3, they're removed. On a 4 through 6, they survive. Once any structures are removed, any remaining losses are rolled over to the retreating soldier forces. Once again, warbands and auxilia can be removed immediately to absorb a loss. Leaders and legions can attempt to survive a loss by making a die roll. 1 through 3, they're removed. 4 through 6, they survive. A quick note regarding game pieces that require a die roll to remove. If a game piece, such as a citadel, survives 1 loss attempt, they can attempt to absorb additional losses as long as they keep surviving. As a result, defenders can use this strategy to absorb multiple losses with 1 strong game piece. Once the retreating defender has absorbed the losses from the attacker, the battle is over. As I stated earlier, we will discuss soldier forces' retreats and the implications of those decisions a little bit later. Now, let's look at a decision path where the defender stands and fights. First, if either player has auxilia or warbands in the fight, they are immediately revealed. All warbands and auxilia remain hidden if the defender retreats. Next, when the defender stands and fights, it's also possible that the attacker's losses are halved. This occurs if the defender has a citadel or a fort in the region. If the defender doesn't have either of these structures, then they suffer the full loss amount. Losses are then applied to forces in the opposite order from a retreat. First, losses are applied to soldier forces. Then, if all soldiers are removed, the remaining losses are rolled over to structures. Finally, any soldier forces that survive the attack may then counterattack. Essentially, this diagram is flipped with a few exceptions. So let's take a look. Okay, I flipped the roles in the diagram. The defender is now on the right side counterattacking, and the attacker now finds themselves on the right side taking losses. The battle equation plays out like before with the following exceptions. First, when calculating losses inflicted by a defender's counterattack, only normal damage is used. Leaders do not multiply loss numbers like in a normal attack. Second, any citadels or forts the attacker has in the same region do not provide a defense bonus that halves the defender's counterattack losses. Other than those differences, losses are applied and absorbed in the same order as a normal attack. The attacker's soldier forces absorb losses first, and then if any losses remain, they are rolled over to structures. Throughout this process, the attacker can choose which of the units in these categories accept the losses, same as before. Certain factions have additional options when conducting their retreat. Let's walk through them. The first situation is whenever the Aedui, Averni, or Belgic factions are defending against the Romans and decide to retreat. Leaders and hidden warbands from these factions may remain in the same region after the battle. This ability represents the Gallic people's home ground advantage. They know the land and just fade away into known hiding places. Of course, these factions may also retreat their soldier units to an adjacent region if certain requirements are met, which we will talk about in a moment. The second situation is when a Gallic faction is attacking anybody else, except of course for the Germans, who never retreat. Gallic factions are familiar with the land. Therefore, if another faction needs to retreat, there are no hiding spaces and they must leave the region. Next, let's look at the requirements for retreating into an adjacent region. In Falling Sky, the retreat eligibility mechanic works in a similar fashion to Roman supply lines, with a few exceptions. Regional control is a key factor in whether a retreating faction's army can escape into an adjacent region. If an adjacent region is controlled by the same faction, then naturally the defenders can retreat to it. However, if no faction controls an adjacent region, then the defender cannot retreat into it. If an adjacent region is under another faction's control, then they must receive permission prior to declaring their retreat. Be aware though, the Germans never agree to harbor retreating forces. If there are no eligible adjacent regions for the defender to retreat into, these forces are removed from the game. Now, let's walk through a basic stand-and-fight type battle to see how all this works. In this example, the Belgic player wants to reduce Roman forces in the region. They initiate a battle command and place a white pawn in the targeted region, then pay the one resource that they owe. Next, the attacking Belgic faction must calculate the damage, in other words the losses, they could inflict on the Roman faction. Soldier forces are the only game pieces that can inflict losses. The Belgic player has 4 warbands. They inflict half a point of loss each for a total of 2 losses. Next, the Roman faction, who is the defender, must absorb these losses. First, they check to see if they have any defensive structures. They do, a fort. With a fort, they're allowed to have their losses. This means they now only need to absorb one loss. Since the Roman faction is making a stand, they must subtract from their soldier units first. They have a choice of losing either an auxilia or a legion. If they select the legion, they can also roll a die to see if that legion survives. The Roman player is not willing to take that risk and decides to just lose one auxilia. Then, since the Roman faction still has soldier forces, they can counterattack. To make this easier to understand, we're going to flip the roles in this diagram. There, now that we've flipped the roles in the diagram, let's finish the counterattack. The Roman faction, now the counterattacker, can inflict a total of one loss on the original attackers, the Belgic faction. This total is derived from one auxilia, which equals 1/2 point of damage, and one legion for 1 point, rounded down to one loss. The Belgic faction has no defensive structures in this territory, so they take the brunt of that one loss. They choose one of their war bands to absorb the loss. And with that, the counterattack is complete and the battle ends. Then, all surviving auxilia and warbands are flipped to their revealed side. Next, we're going to rewind this scenario and look at what would happen if the Roman faction decided to retreat instead. Okay, now that we've reset our example, let's look at what would happen if the Roman player retreated. As a reminder, the attack calculation remains the same. The Belgic forces have inflicted 2 losses on the Roman faction, and then the Romans decided to retreat. When a faction retreats, it halves the losses they would normally suffer. However, since only soldier units can retreat, essentially leaving structures behind, structures are the first to absorb these losses. In this example, the Roman fort is left to absorb the loss. However, since it is a fort, it does get to roll a 6-sided die to see if it survives. The Roman player rolls the die and receives a 6, which means the fort survives. The Roman soldier forces are then moved out of the region. The Roman soldier forces have abandoned their fort, and the Belgic faction now has overwhelming superiority in the region. And with this example complete, we've now finished looking at the commands for Falling Sky. In the next episode of this series, we will take a look at each faction's special abilities. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.